I've been studying large language models since way back in the HAL days, and did my dissertation on recurrent neural networks and things like that. So I've been thinking about these topics a long time, and my research has really been focused on applying them to questions of child development and language acquisition. And so I've been really struck to see these models blow up in interest and capability over the last couple of years. Now the button is not working. Okay. So, I mean, one thing that is, of course, amazing about them is that large language models are really impressive at their ability to produce grammatical and semantically plausible sequences. I think the thing that's even impressed me so much is their ability to do discourse structure and all of that. We don't hear that talked about that much, but the fact that they are not just giving us sentences, but giving us whole large passages of text that are well structured is something that I think not very many people are thinking about or studying. And the fact that that works so well is impressive too. But there are, of course, a lot of shortcomings with them that have been pointed out some in some of the talks today and by a lot of other people doing this research. They're, of course, still pretty bad at generalizing outside the training set. They have big problems with factual accuracy. They have problem solving and formal reasoning difficulties. Mixed results, as we saw today, mixed results as a quantitative match to human data. And of course, there's a big data plausibility problem with the amount of data they require. So if we're thinking about them as models of human cognition or human language abilities, it's actually the case that LLMs alone right now are extremely limited as models of human language cognition. And so I think a really interesting question for us to think about is what's missing. And this is an issue I've been thinking a lot about. And I'm going to focus on just two quick topics. So one is neurocognitive plausibility. So I mean, as got pointed out right at the beginning, these models have their history and their origin in cognitive science and in neuroscience. But no one who's working in cognitive science or neuroscience who's been proposing models like this has ever really credibly suggested that something like a large language model alone is going to be sufficient for human language cognition, right? It's at best a piece of the puzzle. And there's problems with, of course, the local structure that we need to look at with these models. One big thing that everyone knows is that the human brain is doing this in a recurrent way. It's not using a giant context window, right? And obviously the recurrent neural network models don't work as well as large language models right now in their current implementations. But that's a problem that we need to figure out, because it's not just that, it's not a constraint. I don't think it's a constraint that the human brain is using recurrency. I think the recurrency is actually a big part of solving a lot of the problems that I mentioned earlier. Figuring out how to do that right is how you get the right kinds of generalization, and you don't do over memorization, and you get better transfer and all those kinds of things. Another big thing that's really left out of these models is that the hierarchical organization in the models is completely emergent. And on the one hand, that's really impressive that it can do as well as it does, but we know that the human brain is structured to do language processing in a much more direct way. So one of the things people don't talk about, of course, even with the GPT models, is how much better they get as a function of doing the right kinds of tokenization and things like that. So like segmentation is an important part of the process, and doing the segmentation right gives you the right microstructural representation that you need to do the next step and the next step and the next step. And so that's another thing that really needs to be worked on. Reinforcement learning isn't just something that you do at the end. It's something that goes on the whole time when people are learning, and that's another big factor that's missing from models right now. And then, of course, at the global structure level, we know a lot about the brain structure that is very different from the way these models work, right? So there's been a lot of research, even within the connectionist perspective, about multiple memory systems and cortical versus hippocampal representations. We don't talk too much about, large language models are great at semantic plausibility, but they're actually really bad at the other kind of semantics, which is semantic accuracy. But there's a big alignment there between the differences between what we see in cortical processing versus hippocampal processing. What's sort of ironic about large language models is that they're really, really good at semantics, but what they kind of seem to be missing is something more like episodic memory, right? And that's what would help you with a lot of the accuracy, semantic accuracy kinds of facts. They're, of course, also not so good at task and goal sensitivity, although we saw some really interesting work to the contrary just recently. But we know that the brain is set up to specialize in not just learning one giant batch of statistics that are useful across all different purposes, but to do task-specific specialization and to learn specific plans and that there are different brain regions that are important for that. And so factoring those into these models is really important. The other big thing I think the models are missing is developmental plausibility. So I'm a cognitive developmentalist by training, and I think there's a lot that's missed here. So obviously everybody knows about the input plausibility, but it's not just the size of the input, but the nature of the input, right? The neural networks are trained, large language models are trained on the internet. Children are trained on something that is very, very different. And there's all sorts of ways in which that structure is different. Obviously, the multimodal aspect is a big part of it, but there's also the way in which child experiences are fundamentally different. A lot of my research has been looking at how when you start with input that is really small. If you think about like the experiences that children get at the very beginning, you get a lot of sentences like, look at the dog, look at the cat, look at the shoe. That doesn't tell you very much about cats and dogs and shoes, except that they're nouns, right? So it starts to put things into the, like, if you think about the idea of representing knowledge as a taxonomic structure, child-directed speech is helping you organize that structure in a top-down way. It's doing the progressive differentiation that other people like Tim Rogers here in the room have shown that is a really important aspect of this. Child-directed speech really helps with that process. And then there's a lot about neurocognitive development. So starting the system small is a way of downsampling and a way of promoting certain kinds of inductive biases. That's important. And the systems develop and integrate at different rates. That's an important aspect. And of course, then the last thing I just want to mention, I know I'm kind of out of time here, but is that active learning is a huge part of what a child is doing, right? They're not just sitting there passively seeing the world and trying to predict the statistics. They're out there doing active learning in the world, and they have goals beyond just prediction that are affecting what's going on and even the kind of input that they're getting. And that learners have varying degrees of task-specific experience that the language models just don't have. So I think that in order to turn these models into actual models of human language cognition, we have a lot of work to do about going beyond just the simple LLM approach and trying to integrate these models back into a much richer kind of cognitive modeling perspective like we have been doing in cognitive science all along.
So I don't have slides, but I have some notes. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is using LLMs for cognitive science. And when a lot of people, when they say LLMs, they think about the models that are commercially available through companies like OpenAI and Google and so on. And I think that those models are probably not going to be helpful to us and are becoming increasingly unhelpful for cognitive science. So I think that we talked about the amount of data a lot, but there's other things that maybe we don't appreciate enough, which is that the models are trained on source code that's apparently like something like a third to half of the training corpus is source code, and apparently that's very important. I'm actually trying to run experiments to figure out why it's important. They're trained on many languages at the same time, like hundreds of languages at the same time, so that I think they face a very different problem in language learning than babies do. And they are also trained using like these supervised fine-tuning, which is basically if there's a task that we want the model to solve, we have a lot of smart humans explicitly give it answers to that task, and then eventually it figures out how to solve it. And that's a bit more of a traditional machine learning, supervised machine learning approach than the way that we think about them as inferring everything just from self-supervised learning. And the other thing that people might not think about all the time is that the models like GPT-4 probably use a lot of external systems that are not the language model itself to solve some of the problems that we pose to them. So it's just basically impossible to know what happens behind the scenes when we type in a query into GPT-4. And then there's, of course, the issue of data contamination. So it's very hard for us to know that the evaluation that we are giving to the model has not been included in its training set. That's hard to know, even if we have access to the training set, because they can sometimes be, trillions of words, and it's kind of hard to search. But especially the case with those closed models, or models where the training data is not available. So that's a kind of maybe a pessimistic view, but there's definitely the full half of the glass, which is that I think that the technology can be very helpful to us for the reasons that have been articulated at the beginning of this talk, I think, very clearly. But my sense is that we have to train models ourselves, basically, as cognitive scientists. Like we can't keep using models that are available on the internet for totally different purposes and just keep adding caveats. So, well, there's like only so much that we can conclude from this experiment, because we know that this model was trained on 1,000,000 times more words than a child or whatever. Like we just have to stop doing that and train our own models, and it's not so hard. Right? I mean, especially if the model turns on less data, it requires less compute. So I guess I wanted to mention an ongoing project that we've been that I've been involved in, called the Baby LM project. And the idea there is to create a corpus, a standardized corpus that is cognitively plausible to the extent possible. So we have the mix of genres that are a little bit more plausible for a child to be exposed to, like child-directed speech, conversations between adults, textbooks from middle school, and so on. And the total amount of data is also reasonable, tens of millions of words. And so using these sort of researchers that we're developing now to be multimodal as well, we can, I think, test the questions that we're interested as cognitive scientists more directly. The one question that we can test, by the way, is whether the amount of data that GPT-3 or 4 or 5 or whatever are trained on is actually required for the performance that they show. So in practice, it looks like some things you can learn pretty well from not a lot of data. So the criticism of LLMs as a technology is unfair in that sense, because we often don't even try to see what they learn from a small amount of data. So I think like one of the maybe more surprising examples is work that Ethan Wilcox and Roger Levy and other people have done on learning syntactic islands, kind of constraints on how we can form questions in English. And it turns out that you can learn it from the amount of data that a child can plausibly be expected to be exposed to by the age of, I don't know, 15. And the reason that they were able to reach that conclusion is because they used the language model that was trained on that amount of data. That happened to be available on the internet, and maybe can take a small amount of credit for that. So yeah, that's my take on the amount and nature of data for language models. And I think that with the kind of creating the right resources that are increasingly more cognitively plausible, and training models on those resources is something that we could definitely use support for. We need some infrastructure for that. And I'm glad that we are hosted by an institution that can provide such support. I actually don't know how I'm doing on time. I have okay, so kind of switching gears, I really appreciated Ben's point on the fact that language models can sometimes capture the differences kind of qualitatively between conditions. So the language model prefers the afforded to the non-afforded, the continuation, but its preference is very slight compared to humans, who have kind of an overwhelming preference for the afforded. And I think that that's something that we don't do often enough. So I really appreciate that in Ben's work. And we have found kind of similar results for syntactic processing. So it looks like language models do show some preference for syntactically predictable versus syntactically unpredictable continuation, but that preference is order of magnitude smaller than the ones that we see in humans. So humans seem to commit much more strongly to the syntactically expected continuation, and then I guess also to the continuation that fits with their interpretation of the physical constraints on the event. So it looks like overall language models might hedge their bets a lot more than humans. Humans kind of seem to commit to one interpretation a lot more than the model. It seems to be a qualitative thing that we're missing if we're only using language models as a cognitive model. And I think that also is related to what John said about how the models have vastly greater resources than humans, both in terms of context size, but also in terms of their ability to entertain a large number of parallel interpretations. And that paradoxically causes them to generalize worse, or at least differently from humans. And the last thing I wanted to mention, which we can talk about more, is a kind of a reaction to Ariel's talk about how the fact that language models are trained, at least initially, with prediction as their objective function. And then when we find a mapping between the internal representation of the model and the brain, we, the argument goes, can conclude from that there's something special about prediction in the brain because of that mapping. And I think that we need to be very cautious about drawing the conclusion. Here, I think that Alex and one of his students wrote a very nice paper about that, which shows that you can get very good representations that can map onto the brain from many different objective functions, as long as the representation captures enough information about language, right? As long as the representation has a rich enough set of features that capture language. So I think because prediction is such a popular framework, both in cognitive neuroscience and in AI, it's tempting to draw connections between them that where we need to be a little bit more careful sometimes. So yeah, okay, that's what I'm going to say.
Okay. All right. So, well, going a bit back to the talks that we have seen in the session. Is this working now? Yes. Right. So I think that we saw great talks in the session. I really love all of them. I think all of them really offered like very exciting examples of how we can use insights from language models to learn more about our human language processing. Right. So just to emphasize a little bit what we saw in the talks, I would say that maybe the most exciting opportunity that large language models are offering is that they are this kind of simplified but still very computationally concrete models of language, and therefore they offer, they allow us to generate specific hypotheses, or they allow us to have concrete operationalizations for certain theories. I think this has been emphasized in the different talks, and I see these as maybe the most exciting possibility for language models. To this, I would like to also highlight another opportunity that language models are bringing that maybe it's a little bit less glamorous and less related to theory, but that they also can help us with having a deeper empirical study of language, right? More in the spirit of traditional computational linguistics, if you want, right? So if we have powerful representations learned by language models, then we can use them to study at a larger scale patterns in corpora, for example, right? So if we have, for example, good estimates of processing effort that are calculated with natural language models, and we know that these correlate well with different psychometric measures, then we can use these to study, for example, how patterns of effort occur in conversations by using large corpora of conversations, right? Another type of studies, like, for example, in my group, we are also now building multimodal representations of face-to-face conversation where you have information from gestures and also from speech. So if you can learn representations of these multimodal signals that, again, align with human intuitions, then you can use them as tools to analyze different patterns in conversations, like, for example, patterns of coordination across the speakers in dialogue, right? So just to point out that I think that these empirical opportunities that they are offering us more as tools are a good complement to the more theory-oriented and hypothesis generation possibilities that come from large language models. Now, going back to this, to large language models as operationalizations of theories or operationalizations of hypotheses, which I think is really exciting. As I said, we've saw really very, very interesting examples in the talks. I think that we're still quite far from having a well-established method for what kind of conclusions we can draw when we see similarities between language models and human behavior or brain signals and dissimilarities. So I think there is stuff that we can learn, definitely, but it's not always easy to distill exactly what can we conclude scientifically, right? And what are the hypotheses that are actually on the table. And I think that, for example, Ben's talk was exemplar in the sense of trying to make very concrete what were the hypotheses and why they make sense. Still, if I got you right, I think there are still some open questions because you don't know exactly what features or factors inside the model actually lead to a certain observed correspondence or not. So there's still some open questions. And I think that this is this difficulty of drawing scientific conclusions is even more clear when we are investigating brain signals, right? So if we see an alignment, a correspondence, an alignment between the language model representations and the brain activation, exactly what can we conclude, right? And I think that, of course, people have their own opinions of what can be concluded, but I think that I believe that it's still rather an open question of what are conclusions that are reasonable or not. And I hope that we can discuss more about this over the sessions and tomorrow as well.
Does anyone have a starting point, or I can throw out a question if we want? All right, I'll jump in. So I think one of the recurring themes, both of the talks and the commentary, has been that, at least for humans, but also for models, the task matters a lot. And so I think that raises an interesting question of what is the task? Like, what do we think the task is for humans? Is the task learning to produce? Is production the task that drives comprehension? Where does prediction fit into that? Is prediction, a production light that we're using? So how do we decide what the task should be when we're trying to map models onto humans or to, build better models? And where do those diverge?
But the task, you mean the training objective, or?
In a sense, right? What is the human who's comprehending as a baby or as an adult trying to actually accomplish? Like, what is the end goal for comprehension? Is it to predict the next word? Is that what the human is trying to do? Sometimes maybe, but I would say not always. Is it to build a particular kind of conceptualization? And at what point do you know that you've achieved that, right? When do you know that you have I think there's really interesting questions about what the brain is trying to do. And if we don't know what the brain is trying to do, it's going to be hard to know if we're modeling it successfully.
Right. Well, I think I will leave the psycholinguist in the table to answer this question rather than the NLP experts.
All right. I think that the point that I brought up earlier about how we see these much larger effects of changes in the conceptualization of an event when an unexpected word in the sentence appears for humans and language models as evidence that humans do a lot more than prediction. So it's not that humans do not try to predict the next word. That's clearly useful. It can help you read somewhat faster if you try to predict the following words. But it's helpful more on the margins. And I think that the main point of language is to connect to the world, right? So we need to figure something out about the world that we're observing using language. And that is the probably, I don't know how to assign a number to it, 80% of the point of language. Just by judging from the relative weight of in some I'm just thinking of work that we've done where we try to change the relative weights of syntactic predictions from just word predictions. So we try to assign a higher importance to syntactic predictions to kind of get the language model's prediction to align better with human predictions. And we found that syntactic predictions were a lot more important, so you need to upweight them. And I think that is probably the case for even more so for conceptual prediction, where you try to predict where the object will end up at the end of the scene or something, like, you know, intuitive physics kind of predictions and so on. So I think that is probably consistent with what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. Although in a lot of cases, we're using language to talk about things that aren't available in the world. If we can already see that you're picking up your cup, I don't need to tell you about it, right? And we use language to create fantastic worlds in which there are, you know, dancing, you know, chairs and things like that. So it still becomes an interesting question, again, of how the brain decides in a given task. You know, am I trying to align with the world that's right in front of me? Am I trying to align with the 3 sentences back? I mean, I think there are some cases in which alignment with the world and maybe developmentally in some cases weighs in a lot, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, it's easy to kind of rectio ad absurdum the idea that prediction is the primary goal, right? The best way to perfectly predict the language input you're going to hear would be to walk into a quiet room, and then it's an easy prediction job, right? But you obviously have other goals you're trying to achieve. And I mean, and this is where I mentioned, you know, briefly that, you know, reinforcement learning, I think, needs to play a larger role throughout the process. And I think that's coming from, and the idea that active learning is a big part of what's going on. I mean, people are engaged in prediction as a means to an end, but the end is something else, right? But the end is always so different from one situation to another.
Right.
And I mean, with the language models, it's interesting. You have these fun examples. You know, people have done studies. You know, I don't know if people are familiar with all of the work people have been doing trying to, you know, get ChatGPT to play chess, right? And it's pretty good at it. But what's been really interesting are there are some studies that show, or some people that have shown that if you start it off with a sequence of mediocre moves, it will continue to play the mediocre moves, right? So it's, you know, it's clearly, it is, you know, it's if you think of ChatGPT as a distillation of all of the information on the internet, and that includes good chess and bad chess even, and you know, good cooking and bad cooking, and when you have such a huge model with so many parameters, it's able to carve that space up so many different ways, right? It can isolate the mediocre chess and then predict that sequence. But a person is capable of probably doing that. You know, if I ask a good chess player to simulate a mediocre chess player, they're probably okay at it. I don't know. It's an interesting question, but I guess they probably could do it. But that's not the function they're usually trying to achieve, right? And so you need, you know, somehow we need to, you know, work in the idea that people have goals and they are doing planning and they are trying to achieve objectives. And these predictions are representations they are using as a means to that end, but not the end in itself.
Right. Yeah.
No, I mean, just I think everything has been said already about this topic, but yeah, I agree that we typically use language for communicating, right? So for achieving things together, for coordinating, for achieving goals. So that's the main thing that is driving us. That's what's driving us to use language. So often we are abstracting away from these aspects, right? But yes, of course they are fundamental. Yeah. So I wanted to go, if you don't have another, I wanted to go back to something that I think John emphasized, right? And it's the fact that, so on the one hand, it's fascinating to see how the representations that these large language models are learning may align with human language representations or even with brain data. At the same time, we know that they have many problems, right? So from the NLP perspective, we know that they have lots of problems. When we evaluate them, we know that they have many problems. So that's also something that I find quite puzzling. right? So how come that we can use them for these very deep, fundamental questions about human cognition, and that they give very promising results, and at the same time, they are so problematic, right? So in my lab, we work often with multimodal models, and by multimodal, I mean models that are trained both with language and with vision and with images. And on the one hand, we find that the representations that these models learn correlate better, for example, with the human similarity judgments than text-only models, and also that even they look to be better aligned with some brain activations in some specific situations that language-only models. At the same time, when we evaluate them on very simple tasks of language understanding, they fail completely, right? So you may present to a visually grounded language model an image and a few sentences. Some of them are false, some of them are true, and they are just variations on word order, and you would hope that the model is able to distinguish which ones are true and which ones are false. And that doesn't happen. That does not happen above chance. So how is it possible? How is it? How can we have models that in principle align so well while they seem to have very clear deficiencies, right? So I think that's an open question.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to say about that. First of all, I think that the plot that Ariel showed at the end, where the middle layers of the network map better onto the brain than the late layers, resolves that paradox to some extent, because the behavior of the models kind of drifts further apart from the behavior of the humans in some sense, if I understand the implications of that plot correctly. And I also like that because that also goes against the strong alignment between the objective function of the network and the what's happening in the human brain. It looks like that you can do if you predict the human brain better from the middle layers that are actually not so close to the prediction objective function than from the last layer, then maybe prediction is not actually the right way to interpret what's going on. And the other thing that I wanted to say about the alignment between the brain and the models, that I think we're sometimes a little bit too optimistic about the results there. Again, I mean, I'm far from an expert on cognitive neuroscience, and I would love to talk to people more about that. But it does seem that, at least when it comes to language, in a lot of cases, there isn't that much signal for us to model with the representations of the models, and it's not so hard to get pretty close to the noise ceiling in many of these models, and in many of these analyses, and especially when it comes to the specific materials that we're comparing the models to people. So I think that often the theories that we have in cognitive science are based on very specific kinds of sentences that can be a little bit more complex or unusual in some sense, but have a specific kind of theoretical significance. And often in these analyses that map the brain to the models, we actually focus on, like, naturalistic data, which means just conversations between the patient and the nurse, or that are probably relatively simple sentences, and those are probably going to be less diagnostic of differences between the models and humans than the more controlled experiments that you're doing with the image description, which I'm assuming that you're picking two sentences that are very similar except for one small thing, but one applies to the image and the other one doesn't. So I think that those are the kinds of experiments that we need to do to subject the model's representation to a more rigorous assessment. I'm not saying no one is doing it, but I think a lot of the experiments don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot to do to kind of think about how these tests, I think, and how these tests are working in the kind of example you're talking about here. I think, like, those are, I mean, specific behaviors that as humans we engage in. I don't want to say frequently, but some regularity, right? We describe and talk about objects. And it's very reasonable to assume that our brain is, there's something it's like to describe a scene, right? And that there are statistics that are kept separate for those kinds of tasks and regularities that are special for that kind of a task. And we are really good at carving those statistics off and then engaging in that kind of a task in a way that these models still have trouble separating out the kind of task-specific representations unless you do things like prime them, which is effectively like what we saw in the last talk, which is really neat, right? You can find a way to get it to focus its attention on the statistics that are relevant for different tasks, and that's really neat. I mean, one of the big problems I think we're having, and we see that, if we look at a lot of the studies that were presented today, trying to compare human data to the large language models, and it's the same in my own work. So I'm not, it sounds like I'm going to be critical, and here's a second, it's the exact same in my own work. The correlations we're seeing in these are not big, right? We're thrilled if we get correlations of 0.3, and it's not uncommon, to have correlations lower than that are still statistically significant. And I mean, a lot of that is, I think we have a lot of work to do to figure out where the problem there is, right? Because a lot of people look at those numbers and they're not very impressed, right? We're explaining what, 2%, 5%, 10% of the variance. That's not very much. And some of that is because, and I think this may have been something Tal was alluding to, but there really is this possible ceiling of noise that we're running into just even in the human data, right? If you look at the reliability in the human data across subjects or across items or in subject by item interactions, there's just so much variability there that that isn't in the model. And there's just this natural limit. If we might see that a correlation of 0.3 might look pretty good, but it really might be amazing because it might be at the limit of what the theoretical correlation we could even hope to see given the amount of variability in the human data. And I think that's something we need to understand better. The other thing I kind of wanted to bring up on this topic is that, we're still obviously in the very early days, and we don't have a clear theory about the right way it is to align the tasks in the models and the people. If you think about the number of degrees of freedom we have as scientists here when we're using these models, we could use the output probabilities of the model itself to predict the human data. We could use of the normal model, just train on a prediction task, right? Or we can train the models on specific tasks and then consider that to be a better fit, or we can try to use the embeddings to predict data, right? We've seen all of those different things today. And these all give us different answers. And if we give ourselves the degrees of freedom to always just pick the one that fits the human data the best, I think we're gonna inflate how well it looks like the models are doing, right? We need to develop a more solid theory about what are the appropriate comparisons between the model and the people. I found it kind of funny that, historically, if people are familiar with the competence performance debate, it used to always be that there were these, formal linguistic theories that didn't fit the human data very well, right? And some linguists would often say, well, we don't really care because that's performance data and we're not trying to fit performance data. We're just having a theory of competence of what knowledge is in the language system. And it's kind of interesting that in some ways the shoe has shifted to the other foot, right? Where it's now the language modelers who can find somewhere in the model, something in the model we can use to predict some difference, right? And so now it's the language modelers who are I don't want to say they're not worried about the performance data. I still like what the language modelers are doing these days because they're not trying to exclude whole swaths of data as irrelevant. But there still is an issue where we need to really sharpen our theories and understand the relationship between the models we're using and the data that we're trying to predict.
Well, I think with that, we need to move on to the questions. So
The speaker should also join the table now.